Words are a tool, just like numbers, which we can use to model conflict. A book about war is not like war. In fact, it's almost possibly different from war. It's a quiet, inoffensive thing. It sort of sits on the table. War is a horrible, big thing. It kills people. It's nasty. The only way in which a book about war is in any way related to war is that the words that it uses try to capture some elements of the experience of war in a form that can be transmitted to others. Okay? In that, it's really no different in principle from everything else there. A memoir about war, an interview with a veteran, a report about a particular battle, secondary histories, all of these sorts of things are forms of modeling conflict and are not conflict themselves. They are not the thing itself. And then, of course, wargaming. I think wargaming actually unites the features of many, if not all, of the 5 forms of modeling which I've listed above it. Okay, next slide, please. In the book, Simulating War, I have a Venn diagram which looks at recreational wargaming and where that sits in terms of other recreations. Here I've moved the focus up a little, and I've looked at the communities which make most use of various techniques like the one I've just shown you, including wargaming. The one area I think where everybody comes together, and the communities, as you can see, are the enthusiasts, the military, and the academics, is not wargaming, it's war studies, which is what my department's about. Wargaming does fit in an overlap area, but it's the overlap area between the enthusiast and the military. Very few academics do wargaming or take wargaming seriously. That's a big problem for someone like me who's trying to actually break into that area, and that's why it's refreshing to come to an audience such as this where, because of your professional connections, it is taken rather more seriously. Universities, as those of you in them will know if you're trying to do this, are a very hostile environment for wargaming. We're trying to actually move into that area. Okay, next slide, please. There's a couple of definitions of wargaming. It's a nice pithy one, as usual, by James Dunnigan, focused on historical board war games, and that nice title, The Paper Time Machine, quite evocative. Peter Perler, who's here, of course, in his classic work, Art of Wargaming. If you haven't read that, you should. You really must. It's still just as relevant as it was 20 years ago when it was written, and characterizing war games as something which is a simulation, or a representation, should I say, doesn't involve the use of actual military forces, but is affected by decisions made by players. Okay, we can go to the next slide. By definition, particularly for the form of war games that I'm talking about, not so much the negotiation games and so on, but those are representing the conflict part of wargaming. I think there's 2 big elements. The mathematical model, and they are mathematical, even if it's expressed primarily in words, as it is in board game rules. It is possible to program pretty much any board war game into a computer using ones and zeros. So it is in effect a mathematical model, whether it looks like it or not. That mathematical model creates an artificial universe, representing some part of the real universe. But it represents the constraints and the opportunities within that universe. It does nothing in and of itself without the second element, which is the decisions made by the players. Okay? Beautiful way of thinking about this. Clauswitz, I'll be talking about him later on, and appealing to some of his thoughts. He was once presented with what we would now call a scenario. They said to him, look, here's a map, here's where the military forces start off, tell us what the war would be like. And he said, sorry, but why not? Why not? He said, what's the war about? You haven't told me anything about the politics, about why they want to fight in the first place. Yeah? The decisions made by the players, guided by those sorts of objectives and considerations, as well as how to operate within the constraints of the environment. That is fundamental. And the idea that what to me distinguishes a game or war game from a simulation, the simulation is an automatic thing which will create this sort of blind collision of armed masses. The war game is where the decisions come in with players being able to choose to do different things depending on the circumstances. Next slide, please. Right. So that's what I think are the common elements. They're outnumbered by the variable elements. I've listed just 4, though there are others. That's Peter's book, of course, as you know. One is the codification of the rules. When these things really started in the 19th century, you already had the two ends of the spectrum. You had the free Kriegspiel, where there basically were no rules. All you had was an umpire with his military, it was pretty much his, military experience and expertise, and the players would tell him what they wanted to do with their forces, and he would judge how far that unit could reasonably move, what would happen when it came into collision with another, just based on his own military understanding and instincts and biases or whatever. All the way to rigid Kriegspiel, which is like chess, in that there is a codified set of rules, can be applied by players without even needing an umpire to exist, because everything is found in the rule book. There is no need for any outside mechanism to judge what might occur. And of course, there's a spectrum within that. Board war games, recreational board war games, typically go to the rigid Kriegspiel end, because they're typically designed to be played by people without umpires, with the game designer not present. The kind of games that you do, of course, are more usually in the middle of the spectrum, and the umpire or the umpire team has more of a role to play. But anyway, there's one spectrum. Number of participants. Anything from 1, and many games are designed to be played solitaire, or are played solitaire by a single player swapping sides, all the way through 2, up to as many people as in this room, or even more, especially in professional contexts. The board recreational war games tend to be 1 or 2 people. Yours, of course, tend to be bigger. Size and complexity, again, almost infinite variation. I ran a game for a brigade in Britain just recently, where it took me 2 minutes to explain the rules, and it took the brigadier 5 minutes to play the game in front of his command team, which I thought was quite a good thing in terms of his bravery to do that and to risk having egg on his face. And so spoke about his command style. Anyway, all the way from that up to almost unimaginably complex games. There was a review I cited in the book of a game about the Normandy campaign, and it said, this took me 20 hours to set the pieces up. Okay. That's not unknown. And then in the form of representation. Now, people tend to fix on this and think it's really important. I don't, actually. I'm talking here about manual wargaming. But for a given system, the form of representation is a second-order issue. Given systems can often, not always, but often, be represented in several different ways. Take my Lost Battles. That can be played in the form that you see there, with a board and pieces, cardboard pieces. Or it can be played, we do this a lot, with toy soldiers on a nice big board with trees and so on. Or it can be played on a computer screen. The same game. Different forms of representation, but the system is identical. Okay? There are strengths and weaknesses of certain forms of representation, and sometimes games are tailored more to one or the other. But the key thing is the nature of the system, rather than how it is presented to the players. Okay, next slide, please. There's a lot of dispute and debate about terminology. Indeed, I was just talking to some people beforehand, and Brant and I were disagreeing about simulations and games, and can they all be the same, and so on. Doesn't matter, basically, as long as we know what we're talking about. I think what a lot of it represents, as you can see from these 2 quotes, is stigma. Like it or not, there is stigma to the word game. There's a lot more stigma to the term war game. Games seem childish to many people. People are reticent about saying they do it. War games seem to be disrespectful, making light, making entertainment out of something deadly serious. I was just in Arlington Cemetery this morning and passing a funeral. If I'd just gone up to them and said, oh, I'm going to give a talk about wargaming, I don't think it would have gone down that well unless they happen to understand what is going on. Okay? So things like conflict simulation, as you can see with Dunnigan's quotes, are often used euphemistically to mean wargaming, whereas wargaming is often used actually as a term of abuse by people who don't think it's a serious activity at all. The notion of serious games shows that you need to qualify that most games are not serious. Okay, next slide, please. It was simply showing Clauswitz and him saying what war is about. This is long before modern war games came about. And he's saying the closest thing to a war is a game of cards. There we are. The whole range of human activities, war most closely resembles a game of cards. Now that might seem bizarre. If I said a book wasn't like war, well, a game of cards equally very, very different from war. What he's getting at, of course, is that there are elements within a game of cards which are similar to war and different from the things that we do in most of human life. Okay? There is an interactivity, a conflict between the two players, artificial in the case of cards, real in the case of war. There is this contest, a limited contest, very much constrained by rules in the case of cards, very much unlimited or constrained only by physical realities in the case of war. But it's different from what we do in everyday life, interacting with people. If we just go now to the next slide, someone who's written quite insightfully about that is Edward Lookback. It's quite an old book now, 1987. But if you don't know it, I do recommend it to you. He talks about the paradoxical consequences of this interactive competition, which is characteristic of war and of games. Okay. If we could go back, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Right. The paradoxical logic of strategy. You can see from Vegetius, 400 AD, si vis pacem parabellum. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. Okay? Very much the motto of many military forces. Try it in real life, If you wish to stay at home, prepare to go somewhere else. What?
That which you sow, that you shall reap.
Doing the inefficient in war, deliberately. Taking the long way round. Going through the woods rather than, if you want to get there quickly, rather than just going down the main road. Why? Because the enemy will be guarding the obvious route. So you want to surprise the enemy, and therefore you do something inefficient. Invading Normandy rather than invading the Pas-de-Calais, which is the quickest route to Germany and the shortest sea crossing. Okay? These are all examples of this paradoxical logic, and you see exactly the same thing happening in games, but you don't see it in real life for the most part. Next thing. Don't. Right. I'm not paying you to do this. Active learning. I think this is a very, very important phrase to capture what war games help us do. This is a picture from my class, and you can see 3 simultaneous games of my game Hell's Gate about battle in Eastern Front in 1944. We use it to teach the students about factors such as encirclement dynamics, about force-to-space ratios, about the way that armoured operations work, and offence and defence, and so on, the terrain, all these many things, weather. All giving them a feel for it in an interactive, fun way, rather than just me telling them about it. But I don't see war games as purely a means of us, the clever people, educating others about these factors. I think the people who learn most from war games are the people who design them. Because unlike words on a page or pictures that you draw on a map, they are not your uncritical servants. You'll design them and then they will blow up in your face. They will go wrong. And then you will think, there's something wrong with my design. What have I got wrong? And often it's your understanding of the actual conflict. You've modeled it wrongly. And the game, therefore, won't do anything like real life. So you have to actually redesign it. That is very much active learning. And I'll come back to the importance of that game design element shortly. Next slide, please. The other thing about wargaming, simulation indeed, in various forms, is this synthetic learning, synthetic experience. There's a quote from Bismarck. It's learning without the costs. You can learn very effectively by going to war, but people will die, including perhaps you. Far better to learn without that catastrophic risk. There's an example there from a recreational game of World War I fighter combat. You compare that to what people had at the time, which was basically nothing, when they were going up in those sorts of dogfights. And a lot of people would lose their lives who might have been saved had they had a chance to practice without their lives being on the line. Okay? So there's this synthetic experience the benefits of learning, at least to some limited extent, without the cost of death and treasure. Next slide, please. Logical analysis. No time to talk through this fully. In my Lost Battles game, or this book, what I do is look at ancient battle as a generic phenomenon, and I provide a model which will model 36 different battles. The rationale for that is essentially a scientific one. The existing literature on ancient battle has lots of different reconstructions of those battles where people are basically, eminent scholars are basically guessing as to some of the parameters. Here it's plotting essentially army size against army frontage. Here are two Bosworth Hidaspes and Hammond Hidaspes, two plots of different scholars' views of that battle. And as you see, radically different in terms of the relationship between army size and frontage. Who's right? If that was all the plots we had, who knows? Either, neither, who knows? If you can get a generic system which models a whole range of battles, then you can get something like, as you can see there, the trend line, the green trend line, and then you can start to say, well, which is in the mainstream? Which is more like what we know from other battles? And then it doesn't prove anything. Of course, you can't prove anything in historical analysis, but you can certainly say maybe it's more likely than not, and I would suggest that neither of their reconstructions, as they put them, are very likely compared to some intermediate ones. Here's an outlier, Adrian Goldsworthy's suggestions about the Battle of Cannae. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a bit about the other great thing about wargaming, which is dynamic experimentation. On the left there is a slide from a book from about 100 years ago, where German scholars about the battle of, or about various battles, and this is their Battle of Cannae. And what they've done is they've taken a map of where they think it was fought, which is very much in dispute, and they've drawn blocks on it, and you've seen it, I'm sure, in many, or this kind of thing in most military history books. That's fine, except you can draw the blocks any way you like. And they're not going to tell you, yes, I'm right, well done, you win the jackpot. Okay? What wargames do is they allow you to decide, or to experiment with, does it make sense? This is my representation of Cannae. Looks a hell of a lot more abstract and so on than that one does, but it allows the people, the players, to choose where they want to put their forces. Now, the main feature of the Battle of Cannae was that the Carthaginian cavalry, who were here, near the city of Cannae, came through, broke through, came round behind the rest of the Roman line before it could overwhelm their outnumbered forces. If they weren't able to do that, Hannibal would have lost. When given the choice, if you represent the battle in that way, you don't have a big hill here, which is from one of the other reconstructed sites, the Carthaginian player will almost always put their cavalry on the open flank rather than in the area constrained by the river. That would suggest, why would they have done it the way they did had it been as they put it, and also by the way they put a huge Roman camp in the way, even if the Romans, even if the Carthaginians are able to break through. Yeah? So it's not impossible that was the case, but it doesn't seem likely based on the kind of experimentation that you can do with wargames. Okay. Next slide, please. We'll move on to why manual wargames. The first thing to say about this, which may surprise some people, is that these things are still being published. As I say, writers like Smith would tend to assume these are long gone 20, 30 years ago. No, they're not. These are all, actually, within the last few months, actually, I think, current issues of board war game magazines, recreational board war game magazines, each of them containing a miniature game, with die-cut counters and map and so on. Okay? These are being published at a faster rate than ever before. Can we have the next slide, please, to show you that? Next slide, please. Oh, yes, okay. This is from about issue 6 of one of the magazines I showed you. You can't very well see the yellow lines, but don't worry too much about that. These are the full professionally published mounted games, and you can see the number that have been published per year has gone up by a factor of 3 over the last decade. And in the 1990s, many people were saying board wargaming is dead. None of these will ever be published again, it's over. Well, not by the figures there. That doesn't mean, of course, that the number of people playing board wargames is expanding. The print runs are shrinking. But the number of separate games that are being published is greater now than ever before. So at least some people are finding some continuing use in them, rather than just going and playing on their PC or Mac or iPad or whatever it might be. Next slide, please. I'm not saying, despite some of the experiences we had earlier, that computers are terrible and that you should have nothing to do with them. There are, as I'm sure you understand, very, very solid benefits to computerization which can be exploited and can give you a wonderful product. On the left there you see a game published by Panther Games, which has some very nice modelling of World War II combat, such as Greeks that's shown there. You don't need to have a hexagonal grid. The units are shown on a proper map. They adopt proper formations. You can command various subunits within the hierarchy, and the rest will be handled by a reasonably capable artificial intelligence. It will even delay your orders, so you're trying to give orders at a divisional level. Your troops won't immediately execute them because it'll be several hours before they trickle down to the companies to do the individual executions. There's all sorts of wonderful things that computers can do. Here's me, not a very good picture I'm afraid, but in a class, showing you how you can use a first-person real-time computer game, in this case a flight simulation game, to illustrate things such as what can you see, how can you cover your friends in a German formation such as the Schwarmer versus a much closer British formation such as the Vic. Do it in real time, only takes 5 or 10 minutes. I can actually give the joystick to the students. They can go around and have a go for themselves while I talk about it. Okay, so there's lots and lots of good things which is very difficult to do with any form other than computerization. But, and this is the big but, next slide please. Excuse me. There are advantages of cost and convenience doing it other ways. Here are some of my board games that I use, and you already saw an illustration of the class context. I could have brought those across, and had we used this time differently, just this time for a couple of hours, we could have been playing, or you could have been playing, those board games in this room as it stands. If we wanted to play computer games, we would need to have had a whole series of network computers set up here, and very costly and so on, to put that together, and actually a hell of a lot costlier and less convenient to design the games in the first place, compared to some simple war games. Sometimes it only takes me a day or less to design a game which could be played within this sort of context. That's, of course, very important in the current environment, and I don't kid myself. One of the reasons I think why manual wargaming is coming back is because we can't afford fully computerized versions anymore, and we want to do something cheap and cheerful. But it's not just that. Next slide, please. War games are independent of technology. Dunnigan, in the last edition of his classic book on wargaming, basically says, this is from the 1990s, computer games are the future. And he lists this whole series of computer games. Unless you're really a technical whiz or have got a very old computer system, you could not play any of those now. Many of them, they're only 10 or 15 years old, those games. The computer systems have moved beyond them. This is my collection, a bit sad, but there we are, some of it. But I can take any one of those off the shelf, and they're just as playable as when they were designed 40 years ago. In fact, some of the ones from 40 years ago are far more playable than some of the ones that are playable today. All right? What that means, in combination of the cost and convenience and the fact that there's this growing archive of playable manual war games going back 60 years or more, whereas computer war games, you've only got the very latest ones before you get a new version of Windows and everything is redundant. It means that the ratio between the number of manual games, recreational at least, that you can find and play, and the number of computer games that you can find and play is at least 10 to 1, some would argue far more, and is growing. The dominance of manual wargaming over computers is growing as more and more manual games are published, and as you get fewer computer war games published because they tend to be bigger budget, graphics-intensive products rather than the fairly cheap and cheerful products of the 90s. So independence of technology, very important. Next slide, please. It's not even as if computers give you great advantages in terms of the display of information. Human eyes are wonderful things. Central acuity, great peripheral vision. Computer displays, fixed resolution. Okay? That's what you get if you've got lots of monitors, board games with maps and counters. It's at least as good, and it's actually at least as easy, if not easier, to move a counter on a map as it is to manipulate mice and so on for the computer screen. So there are practical advantages to It's a manual alternative. Next slide, please. Focus and transparency. Now, with computers, we get spoiled. We get lazy. We can try and put in everything because the computer is capable of including everything if we've got the time to program. Manual games, you need to keep it simple, so you need to focus. You need to zero in on the things that really matter. I showed you earlier some computer games of air combat. That's the manual game of air combat, Tactical Air Combat, that I have in my book on the left there. Its focus is on the big picture, getting students to understand dive and climb, angles, energy tactics, not at the level of the individual aircraft and the differences between a Spitfire Mark 5 and a Spitfire Mark 9 and so on, but in terms of the big picture of being 2,000 feet higher at the start of the engagement, starting off in the front or at the back, and so on. Okay? Focus on the things that matter, and they will be clearer to the students. Same sort of thing here. I'll show you later some some computer games about urban combat. Here's a board game which is in the book, blockbusting, and as you see, very big picture, very low resolution sort of thing, but trying to capture the key dynamics, like don't go into the street unless you've got overwhelming covering fire against the enemy, otherwise you're dead. This brings that out very, very well. Not only does it bring it out well, I think, but it's transparent. The rules are there for the players to see. They can see the assumptions that are being made. The computer system might be easy to play, but you don't know what's going on within it. It's an expert system designed by experts for a mass of non-expert players. Games have to be simpler, but unless the players understand the system, by reading the rules, they can't actually engage with it to any serious effect. But once they understand it, they can start to question it. And they can start to challenge the assumptions, which is a good thing. Next slide, please. Because I think far and away the most important merit of manual war games compared to computer games, except for the few polymaths who can do computer programming as well as understand war, there are some, and there are some in this room, but there are not that many in the population as a whole. The beauty of it is their design accessibility. Illustration over on the left there, a board game came out about one of my pet topics, night fighting in World War II, by Lieber and Wood. It was a game that was designed actually to be run by an umpire who would keep the secrets, and then you would fly around and blunder around and try and actually find the enemy bomber. Unfortunately, it needed that umpire because it was unplayable without it. However, it occurred to me I could probably write some artificial rules which would allow that to happen without needing the umpire, to do it automatically, in other words. So I did. It took me a few days. Then I sent it to Lee. He liked them, so we published it on the web. So now it's actually out there, and indeed it's part of the reviews of the game, that's part of it. Okay? I couldn't have even dreamt of doing that with a computer game, because I simply do not have the programming expertise even to deconstruct what it's doing, let alone to start adding to it in that way. Okay? So it encourages players to be able not only to understand what's going on under the hood, but to add to it, to tweak it, and in the end, to start designing their own games. These are all games I mentioned to you. I get my MA students to spend some of their time during their various MAs to design simulations, design games from scratch on topics like Fallujah, Lebanon War, Afghanistan, and so on. And they do pretty well. Most of these students have never played a board war game, let alone come anywhere near designing one. And yet they can get up to this sort of level. We couldn't even dream of doing that if I required them to produce a computer-programmed war game. We use the computer only for the graphic design. Most people are more comfortable with. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the main three things I wanted to address. Let me just say a bit now about those latter three issues which are nested within it. One is accuracy versus simplicity. I talk about this a lot in chapter 2 of the book. It's a delicate balancing act. You cannot have the best of all worlds. It's the least bad choice. Peter Perler, in his classic work, makes that clear. Next slide, please. If you go too complex, people will not be able to follow what you're doing. There's the combat results table from the war game, but I'm going to use otherwise examples from non-wargaming works. That's Stephen Biddle. classic work, military power, that's an equation from it. It's trying to model breakthrough operations in 20th century warfare, which is a complex thing. So it needs lots of parameters and variables. Some of you may be able not only to read the equation, but to actually make sense of it. I can't. And all credit to him, but what the effect is most of us really have to take it on trust or just read his words. Do you see? So there's an aspect where the costs of complexity, not only in war games, but in any kind of analysis, are such that people find it difficult to grasp what you're saying, and how justified it is. Next slide, please. But it works the other way too. And again, I used the example of, in this case, the mathematical modeler Lanchester, and his famous law, the square law. It's illustrated in the graph from his book. And basically what he's saying is defeat the enemy in detail. If you have a force of 1,000 blue versus 1,000 red, if you can cut them up so you meet 500 red, and then meet the other 500 red, you'll get something like this. It'll only cost you 130 casualties or so to beat the first 500, and then even fewer to beat the second 500. They're all dead, and you end up with 700 men left. Okay? You can read the arguments that he puts forward. The point is, in relation to model of real war, it's not nonsense, but not that far away from it, frankly. In terms of the actual logic that he uses, the assumptions that he makes are just so simplistic that they really do not work. It so happens, for reasons I discuss at length in the book, that he makes some compensatory errors, so by coincidence, sometimes it does work. And indeed, defeating the enemy in detail is a reasonable military tactic. But that doesn't mean to say that his modeling has captured the reason for it. Okay? Because it's far too simplistic. So, as I say, you can't have an ideal, you need to strike a balance, and it's always going to involve the least bad. Next slide, please. Computers allow you to incorporate more detail in your model while retaining a significant degree of playability. You might think, great, it is the best of both worlds. Well, sometimes perhaps, but not necessarily. The screenshot is from BBS2. Many of you will be familiar with it. This is used by many militaries around the world as a tactical training aid. And literally, like in Avatar, you can step into this virtual world. You can be a soldier like that. You can walk down these streets, modeling Baghdad or Fallujah or wherever. The ballistics, all of this stuff is very, very well modeled. And you might think, well, what more could you ask for? How on earth could manual games compete with that? This is an example of bottom-up modeling. You model every little bit of the physical environment, and then if the physical environment in the game is a true representation of the physical environment in reality, players can do whatever they want, and then hopefully you'll get realistic results emerging. Except it doesn't happen. The reason it doesn't happen, of course, is that only certain aspects of conflict are quantifiable. A, and B, this is not real war, it is a game. Even if in a simulation such as this, you have players representing each of those soldiers, they're not artificial intelligence, they're real players, and they're going out, and they're all got their avatars and so on. The typical result, especially when played recreationally, in a firefight is it will last 10 minutes or so, it will end with all of one side dead and half of the other side dead. That doesn't usually happen in reality. The reason it doesn't happen in reality is because in reality they would really be dead. Not just, oh damn, I got killed, reboot. Yeah? That has a huge impact. We don't want to make it real. Remember what I said earlier about vicarious experience. We could wire them all up to electric chairs and electrocute them if they got killed. They'd probably be much more cautious. But the whole point of the game is not to have them killed. Yeah? There is an inherent artificiality to the game which we do want to preserve. Otherwise, we might as well have a gladiatorial combat and send them out in a battle run somewhere with live weapons. Yeah? We would get some interesting factors there as long as we could motivate them to fight at all, which would be a real problem, trust me. But you see the point. The artificiality has costs as well as benefits. Now, the top-down, which is much more characteristic of manual design, Inherent in it is the focus. You have to choose. You can't model every single little bullet and where it's going to go and so on. You need to take an overview, but you can much more effectively take an overview of the human, the unquantifiable, as well as the quantifiable factors. You can look at what really does happen in firefights, rather than what happens when you put in all the bottom-up things and press a button and see what happens. And you can tweak it, such that, for instance, when soldiers are fired at, they're going to go and hide. It doesn't matter how much you shout at them, they're going to go and hide, because they don't want to get their heads blown off. That is imposed top-down by the system. So that can be at least as realistic, big picture, as something such as this. Next slide, please. Research and validation are absolutely fundamental, of course. Otherwise, we are talking purely about games and nothing about simulation. That's why I always call these things simulation games. The simulation part is you're representing something in reality. In order to do that, you need to have the research and the validation. This is easier for recreational games, which focus mainly on the history, because at least we know what happened in one real battle and we can try and simulate it. It's a big challenge for people like most of you who are trying to simulate the future, because who knows what's going to happen. And you need to go an indirect route of saying what happened recently, what happens in trials, how much can we transfer that across, rather than what actually happens in the real battle I'm trying to simulate, because it hasn't happened yet. Recreational guys have an advantage in that. The disadvantage for them is that they're producing entertainment products. They're trying to sell them to customers, individual customers, and if they aren't having fun, they're not going to buy the game. So it's a bit like the problems of having Hollywood films be a realistic representation of reality. If it's not fun, people won't buy it, and so you defeat the object. But fundamental for our purposes. Next slide, please. There's a trade-off between detail and speed of play. Two simulations, both of the games, both of the same battle, course and pocket. That one obviously has much higher resolution, much better ability to represent the real terrain, lots more counters, lots more fine division of the units, but takes, as you might imagine, a lot longer to play. This one I know can be played in a couple of hours because we've done it with the students. That one, not a hope in hell of doing so. It's a trade-off. Indeed, games, perhaps forgot to emphasize earlier, games are all about dilemmas and trade-offs. If you know what should be done, if it's clear what should be done at a particular point, you don't really need a game. You can program that into artificial intelligence in the system, be it manual or computerized. Games are about dilemmas and trade-offs. The trade-off here is, as you can see, and I think it's far better to have a simple game that is played. People will learn far more from that than a complex game which is not. People will often buy games such as the one on the left and not play them, or play them only once. That's perhaps not teaching them as much as playing something like this over and over again, tweaking it and so on. Okay, next slide please. We'll move on to the issue of the fog of war. Very important. Look, Clauswitz says so. Uncertainty dominates in war. He didn't say war is like a game of chess. He said it's like a game of cards. For that very reason, I think. What do we do about that? Next slide, please. One means is to model it directly. You can do it pretty well in computer games, but you can also do it pretty well in manual games. You'll be all familiar with the paradigm of the blue room and the red room, each just seeing their own map with their own units on it and a control coming and telling them when they've bumped into the enemy. If you haven't got an umpire, then you can do it, as is shown on the right, by having blocks which are revealed to you but are a blank back to the enemy, and maybe some of them are dummies and so on. So there's all sorts of means of directly simulating the fog of war. So presumably any game that doesn't directly simulate the fog of war is worthless as a simulation of the uncertainty of warfare. No. Next slide, please. There are costs, there are problems with direct simulation. I've no time to go into all of them here. This is, again, from my book, which does involve the fog of war as a primary element within it. It's a bit like battleships. It's a bit like a bluffing game and guessing game, and there are some elements of combat which are like that. That then tends to dominate the game, to the exclusion of player understanding of other elements. It also means, it's very important, that it's difficult for the designer to test the game, because how can he divide his mind in half and be able to play the game against him or herself? There are other ways to achieve the same effect, depending on where you want the focus to be. Next slide, please. Let's take an historical campaign such as the invasion of France. Deception, intelligence gathering played a vital role in this campaign, as I'm sure you know. Operation Fortitude prevented the Germans from finding out and figuring out that we were going to invade Normandy. It pretended we were going to invade in the Pas-de-Calais here, so that they put the bulk of their forces there. It even succeeded in making them keep some of their forces there once we'd invaded in Normandy, because they thought that might be just a feint and we were going to launch a follow-up into the Pas-de-Calais once they'd all moved and now we could encircle them all. How on earth can you capture that without having secrets in the game where the Allies have to have their invasion plans and can the enemy guess them? There are games that directly simulate that. Most, though, like this one, Liberty Roads, take a different approach. They use two offsetting abstractions to cancel one another out and have the same effect. And that set of abstractions is basically that you allow the Allies to decide on the fly where they're going to invade. And they have one big invasion and another smaller invasion. Historically, it was in Normandy and then here in the south of France. But imagine that you let the Germans set up and then the Allies can decide where they're going to attack. What are the Germans going to do? They're going to look at this and they're going to say, they can invade where they want, we better put most of our forces in the most vulnerable point here, the Pas-de-Calais. But of course, if we do that, put them all there, they'll invade somewhere else. So we'll put some here and not very many over in Brittany. All right? Exactly what they did historically. And furthermore, if the Germans know that there's going to be a follow-up invasion somewhere but they don't know where, because the Allies got the choice, even once somewhere like Normandy's been invaded, they'll keep some forces in the Pas-de-Calais, just in case we don't invade there, but we invade there. And if they do that, we probably will invade there. Yeah? You see how, for very simple sequencing, these abstractions cancel one another out and you achieve the same effect without some of the costs of the game of secrets. Next slide, please. It depends what you're trying to achieve. If your focus is on mirroring the experience of real commanders, and it may be, then direct simulation of the fog of war may be the most appropriate, because you want them to understand how uncertain and nasty and difficult things are, rather than it's like a game of chess. But if you want your players more to understand the overall combat, the overall conflict, rather than being in the role of a player, as of a commander, then your simulations may well be more working models than they are command simulations. And the indirect approach that I've just outlined may be preferable. These are two simulations of mine about Hannibal's campaigns. One's the Battle of Cannae, which I've already shown you. The other is of Hannibal's early campaigns in Italy. One approach is to say, you're Hannibal. You, the player, are Hannibal. You better be good, because otherwise you're not going to do as well as they did historically. But you're the player, you're the one who's got to make the choices and decisions. Unless you typecast and you get the really good player to play Hannibal and the really crap player to play his Roman opponents, you won't usually get anything which resembles the real campaigns. The other approach, which is adopted in both of these, is you program the advantages of Hannibal and the disadvantages of the Roman command structure into the game. Hannibal becomes a game piece under the player's control. The players are more like, the immortal gods with their chess pieces of the humans, do you see? And you might think, well, what on earth is the value of that? Because you want them to understand what the conflict as a whole is like, not just, I want to be Hannibal and role-play Hannibal. Yeah? So you're much more likely to achieve a historical outcome, regardless of the relative skills of the players, and they will each get the big picture rather than just someone fed me a bit of information about this and I have no idea what was going on there because I wasn't told. Do you see? Depends what you're trying to achieve. Okay, next slide, please. And let's move on finally to this vexed issue of the luck of the dice. That's Barney Rubel from Naval War College, and read that and I'm sure you'll empathise with some of the points he's making, particularly from a military point of view. And that's fine, but, let me appeal again to Clauswitz. Next slide, please. Just as war is the realm of uncertainty, so, in fact linked to that, it is the realm of chance. Clauswitz really took issue with those like von Bülow of his own day, who said there's mathematical equations which you can use to model war and they will tell you who's going to win and what to do. He said, no way. All sorts of things coming in through the human factor, the incalculables and so on, which are fundamental to war. War is not like a game of chess. So one way or another, it has to be brought in. The issue is how it is brought in. Next slide, please. Most game designers, far from saying that we should exclude the role of chance and try to model everything, as in fact Bruegel seemed to be suggesting, I'm not sure it really was, say that we haven't done enough to model chance. This book, The Black Swan, Peter Perler, of course, has written a lot about how we neglect this issue of the unknown unknowns. Even if you have variation, that presumes you know in advance what the range of variation might be, but often it's not until the real event that you see it's something completely different from what you anticipated. Yeah? And another book there, of course, about the role of chance and incompetence. How can one bring it in? Next slide, please. I'm afraid it's another delicate balancing act. War games are somewhere in between those three poles: reality, skill, and chance. They're right at the pole of reality. It's not a war game, it's a book about the battle. It never changes, always has the facts as we understand them. There we are. It's a pure game of skill, like chess, nothing about war. It's just a test of player skill. If it's pure chance, it's something like snakes and ladders. Merely a matter of who rolls the best dice. War games are somewhere in the middle there, and they can be wherever you choose. It's a design choice. If you put them somewhere along this line, then unless you have an uncanny ability to model every single event, like when the commander sneezes or when a breath of wind comes along and knocks the plans off the table into the river or whatever, which I think is rather ambitious, then it's not actually going to correspond to reality. It's not going to correspond to what actually happens in war, as Clauswitz says. Okay? But of course, the more you make it just down here or along here, the less that there's any impact of player skill. Even if they do palpably silly things, they won't have any greater advantage than if they do something which makes sense. So it's all this delicate balancing act. Die rolls, or any other random feature, and of course again it's a second order issue. Die rolls is one, a guessing game is another, scissors, paper, stone, whatever. That's just a way of introducing chance, or a randomizer within a computer. All of them have the beauty of being simple. And that's very important actually, because the real world is almost unutterably complex. Simplifying the things that you don't want to focus on by encapsulating them within a simple system such as a random die roll is a very, very important technique. People might not like it, people might not like it when they roll a die and it's a poor one, but that's life, That's life. Sod's law. When you're late for the office, that's when someone's going to break down on the freeway. How are you going to simulate that? By modeling every single car on the freeway, or by rolling a die, you roll one. Shit, right? Okay? That's the best, simplest, easiest way to do it, and it's realistic. It's realistic, and in fact I think Black Swans are best brought in by that sort of mechanism. Roll a series of ones. An umpire could say, oh, what's happened? There's a volcano in Iceland that's blown up, and it's stopped all air travel. That's why none of you have been able to fly. Oh, that's ridiculous! Till it happens, yeah. Okay? So you've always got to balance this accuracy versus simplicity, and die rolling at least is quick. Next slide, please. More fundamental from a design point of view is what the designer chooses to program in with regard to the range of variation. Give you an example of an historical battle or campaign. Graph it out according to which side wins. And in this case, this side, side A, wins a medium victory. All we know, even about historical battles, is that that happened. On the one occasion, the battle actually took place. When we then constructed war game to model it, which can be played multiple times, we are effectively choosing, whether we know it or not, which of these various ranges of variation will occur. You can design a game which has a very narrow range of variation, such that the historical result is pretty much predetermined. Very little variation through chance or player decisions. You can design it to be really broad, so that there's a huge spread. It's only almost coincidentally that it might occur the historical result. You can design it, of course, to be offset. You can say, I think the historical victor was lucky, and therefore, most of the time, I think they won't win by anything like the margin that they did. Or, and this I think is by far the most common in reality, it's not a normal Gaussian distribution at all. It's a distribution much more on chaotic principles. Most of the time, perhaps, the results are clustered around the historical, but something sometimes can push it way away, even to the extent of the other side winning. Something such as, in the World War II, let's say that Britain had been invaded and conquered. Unlikely, for all sorts of reasons, but had it happened, just think of the huge consequences that would have had on the course of the war. Because even, if you've been, the Americans have been in the war, where on earth would you have based from to try and liberate the continent of Europe? Okay, that's the norm. It's actually easy to capture. It's not hard to capture it. This can happen with any reasonable World War II war game. Roll a 1, hit Britain falls, there you go. That's a nice chaotic distribution with very simple rules. But it's your design choice. And if you don't like it, you simply write the rules in a different way, so it can't happen. But that's your choice, and you need to recognize consciously that's your input. Next slide, please. Okay, let me conclude. 3 points which I think sum up what I've been saying. Manual war games are not inevitably complex things with dozens of pages of rules and hundreds of counters. Many of them are, sadly, at the moment, for various reasons, because they sell better and the people who play them have been playing them for many years and can handle the complexity, but they don't need to be. The 8 simulations that I include in my book illustrate that, I hope. They can, though, even simple ones, still effectively simulate selected aspects of real conflicts. It's almost spooky the way that a few pages of rules and a few little counters on a map can mirror dynamics that we observe in reality. Such as, for example, in my Hell's Gate game, the Germans being concentrated in a pocket around the village of Shenderovka and having to break through the Russian lines to be able to escape. That happens very often in the game with just a few pages of rules. But most importantly of all, and this is what really is the case for manual war games continuing, you don't need to be a great computer programmer to design them and to tweak them. One of Dunnigan's most important statements, if you can play them, which is admittedly a big if for complex manual games, not so much for simple ones, but if you can play them, then you can design them with all the many, many benefits that design input can give. Final slide, please. We're going to have a discussion now. We've got best part of an hour, which would be great. We're not going to have time to more than scratch the surface of many of these issues any more than I have had time to do so far. One of the great beauties of computers is that we can continue the debate online. Both my books I've established Yahoo groups for, and they have flourished. The one for Lost Battles, you can see the address there, or just Google Sabin Lost Battles, you'll find it. Has now amassed 3 times the number of words that are in the book. That's not just me, maybe not me. It's lots of other people engaging in discussions and debates and so on. Simulating War one has had literally hundreds of posts in the past few weeks alone. Okay, come along. You can see the posts; they're open to everybody. If you'd like to take part, which I hope you will, just sign up, and then you can engage in the discussion yourself. So not all of you will have a chance to ask questions now. I do hope that you can use the wonders of the internet in slower time to be able to continue the discussion. Right, enough from me. Move to the discussion phase.
Okay, just a quick reminder to make sure you're speaking into a microphone when you make your comment, otherwise we won't be able to hear. For those sitting at the back table, we'll have a portable mic that can be passed around between you, and Tim and I will sort of moderate. So with that, questions, comments? Oh, yes, and you can email in questions if you're listening from at home. And for those at the table, you just hit the button to turn the microphone on.
John Dentico, I wanted to ask you if you could comment comparing computer-based games and manual games in two areas. One is the human interaction of people gathered around a table, if you will, in a manual game. And the second part, the learning attributes, if you will, of process, how and why something is done versus content. I don't know if that's clear.
Just go a bit more on the process versus content.
Yeah, my experience in manual gaming is people, especially in a complex environment, learn process, the why and how of something from a manual game more so than they would from a computer game.
Sure.
Whereas content is much more a press a button and what happens.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Thank you.
Right, yes. In both cases, I think manual scores more highly. You can have a network computer game and you can engage with these sort of faceless people and see what they're doing. Sitting with people, engaging with them, as we are doing now, has a tremendous advantage over that. I'm really pleased that I'm here in the flesh and that so many of you are here. It's great to have so many who are online. They're not getting the full experience. They haven't had to travel, they haven't had to fight with the Washington traffic, but they're not getting perhaps the full experience. The same is true, I believe, in computer gaming. It doesn't mean to say, of course, that real generals look at each other over the table as they play this game of cards or whatever, so we're not simulating a reality. But when you are interested in interactions within your own side, and so many of them are important in that way, the human side, I think, is very, very important. You saw the games that I played with multiple player teams, you know, and they're discussing with each other, what are we going to do? How are we going to do that? The dominance that emerges, winning and through in the argument. Those are very important, and they don't necessarily come through as easily in the computer environment. And on the process versus content, I absolutely agree, and it's part of the fact that the rules are transparent. They can see what's going on, they can see how it's embodied, they can read the design notes that the person has produced, and in fact most of my books are design notes rather than rules. They can see the rationale for what's been done, so in effect they're learning from the words and seeing how they're articulated in practice. Okay? The one drawback, so I think it's important to be fair in this, the one drawback perhaps that can occur with manual games compared to computer games is once you know the rules, you play the rules rather than the reality. And so you need to be careful of that. And sometimes computer games can actually allow you to think, I don't know anything about the rules, but in real life I would do X, and so let's do X. And in Kriegspiel environments, sometimes the umpires were told, even if there is rigid rules, don't tell them to the players, just say use your military judgment. That is a real trade-off, a real problem which does occur with manual games. Nevertheless, I think that the benefits of understanding the process outweigh it.
One of the
Microphone,
methods that we...
Press your buttons.
Stuart Wilk, Center for Army Analysis. One of the methods we use to minimize the gameplay, play the game rather than play the situation, is have each side conduct a complete mission analysis and develop a course of action. Now, if they want to change the course of action, they've got to justify that to the fight cell. Is your selected course of action sufficiently evidently futile to change? Then I'll let them do that. If the futility is not yet convincingly demonstrated, they have to stick to it.
Sure, okay. There are various ways that one can do it. Indeed, there are some forms of games which deliberately downplay the rules, and rather than just being entirely the whim of the umpire, it's called matrix gaming, you need to make arguments such as that. I've just attacked here, and I'm going to win because, make up what you want. I've got the better tanks, I've got the initiative because of that, and so on. And the other side makes arguments as well, you see. So that's one way in which they can be thinking much more about the reality underpinning it than the precise rules that have been given to them. There are various ways of doing that. The approach that I've suggested has the merit, though, that if they can see transparent rules that have been given to them, first of all, they're not as frustrated as they might be in your case. I want to do this, but he won't let me.
But what do you have the rules?
Yeah, okay. But you're saying they have to justify to you why they can change things.
What they have done, what they have to justify is changing their selected course of action.
Okay.
Not, the rules are
Oh.
set, they set a COA,
Okay.
they have to argue for changing their COA.
I understand. Sorry. Yes. They have to argue for changing the COA. I don't mind, particularly with very quick playing games in the wash-up. So what's wrong with the rules? So in what ways were you playing the rules? And let's see how you think the game should be changed, because they become partners in your game design. Okay, I'll give you an example. The blockbusting game that I showed you, the very simple urban warfare game. The sequence of play, as it's written, is that you advance your forces into the street, whichever ones you want, and then you shoot with the ones who stayed in the buildings to see if they suppress the enemy. Consequence of that, of course, is you don't know whether you've suppressed the enemy before you take the risk of advancing into the street. Very quickly, the students start to say, well, why can't we shoot first and then move? Because then we'll know. And then we get into the discussion. Which of those is more realistic? Do you know that it's safe to go in the street? 100%? Okay. And immediately you're into what's real. And that's the purpose of it. These are means to an end. The purpose is for them to understand what goes on in reality, involve them in the design, and in many ways you do get the best of all worlds. But in order to do that, you really need to have simple, quick rules that they can understand and can be played and perhaps even replayed. If you go with a huge, complex game, it's almost impossible to say, let's change this on the fly and let's have another game which will last another 10 hours. So, yeah, all sorts of possible ways forward. And as I say, none is ideal. They all have compromises, but they all have some strengths.
So, this is Serge Romero with Blue Down. I just have a quick question. I was really curious about the transition from being a user of the game into a designer. So I'm just curious about how you would navigate that with some of your MA students. When do they make that transition? If you can describe it, because I'm very curious about that active learning component of this.
Absolutely. The MA students enter the course in conflict simulation. They know that over the course of the 6 months, they are going to be required to design the game, to design this project. So that's always the ultimate end. We'll start off by playing some of the games that I've shown you here, so that those who have no familiarity at all with this, which is the majority, can get some of the basics. Do you see? I will then lend them, you saw that huge collection sitting there gathering dust, I will then go through that collection. I'll choose the ones that are most appropriate for whatever historical topic they've chosen to model, and I will lend them the rules and the map for those games and encourage them to actually read them and indeed think about playing them. So you're getting this, we can't afford to do it all in class because we just don't have the time in class. But so that's where they're seeing what's already been done. And from that, I then will work with them. I'll advise them, they'll produce drafts. I will advise them on how they can be improved. They'll have playtest sessions with their colleagues, and they'll playtest each other's games, iterative improvement, and so on. It's a very, very challenging thing to do, and the students usually get pretty good marks because of the huge amount of work they're putting into this, disproportionate to what they would put into a standard dissertation or essay. Even though the length might be the same, trying to write wargames rules that work and make sense over and over again in that time is a challenge. So we do try to mirror this idea. You start off playing games, you graduate to playing games about a particular subject, and then you see how you could do a simpler version for yourself. Okay? So that's basically how it's run, and we're continually making improvements. But that's what I would suggest. James Dunnigan, who's really the fount of a lot of wisdom, second only to Peter Peller, on all of this, had 2 rules for game designers. One was keep it simple. Very good. The other was plagiarize. You're not alone. You're standing on the shoulders of giants who've designed lots and lots of other games on this. Use what they've done, modify it, develop it, and so on. Okay?
I've actually got a question from the folks listening at the Naval War College. How do you handle issues of time when designing a game, particularly when the time you want to simulate is a lot longer than the available play time that you have? So time compression.
Not so much of a problem, actually. We very rarely do games that are real time. The standard way, of course, is you divide, for a manual game, is you will divide the time into a manageable number of turns, typically around 10. So basically, if what you're simulating is the whole Second World War, as we do, 5-year war, 10 turns, 6-month turns, there you go. And you can play out the whole Second World War in 90 minutes, and we do. Okay? If it's a battle and it lasts a day, each turn is an hour. You see? So it's much more an issue of the level of resolution, and it's like the temporal equivalent of how fine-grained your map is. The key limitation the students have to face is that their simulations must last no more than 2.5 hours. There are physical constraints as well, like no more than 100 counters, no more than a 17-inch by 22-inch map, no more than 7,500 words of rules, but the key thing is it's got to be playable in that time, and essentially you do that by abstracting on the time dimension just as you do, or choosing the resolution accordingly of the time dimension just as you do of the others.
Yuna?
Yes, thank you. Yuna Wong, Marine Corps Combat Development Command. And my question was about your Venn diagram slide.
Yep.
On it, you have conflict modeling, but I noticed much of the emphasis was on interstate conflict. You had international relations theory, game theory, and so that theory, the established theory is very, very state-centric. And you also have the body of practice in military operational analysis and in military combat simulations, which again is very conventional war and interstate.
Yeah.
And I noticed in your presentation, all these ABD examples are also interstate conflicts.
Yeah.
And so the question is, it certainly would give one the impression that the overwhelming body of practice for these type, manual games is also interstate conflict. And given, I think, especially for many of us here in the United States, the interest in subnational conflict and what we term here irregular warfare, I'd be very curious about your comments about manual games and subnational conflict.
Okay, thanks for that, and very, very important, as you say, because it's the current major preoccupation. There's not that much different from the gaming point of view, the modeling point of view, about a high-intensity force-on-force intrastate conflict as from interstate. It doesn't matter whether it's a freedom fighter group that's controlling a particular area or it's got the attributes of a state from the point of view of the military combat. What matters, what differs, is the importance of the political dimension of restraint and of factors other than force on force. Okay? I think two reasons why I've concentrated mainly on the force on force dimension in this presentation. One is that most of the manual games that are done recreationally are historical, and there tends to be more of a force on force dynamic to that, certainly pre-1945, compared to the modern focus on much more complex operations. The other is, I've only got limited time, and I wanted you to grasp this part of it, because then the other stuff tends to build on this armature, all right, rather than being completely different. It's not completely different. Can one simulate the kind of challenges we're facing in Afghanistan or we're facing in Vietnam, for example, with games? Yes, you can. Can you do it with manual games? Yes, you can. I gave the example at the talk at CNA this morning of a game from the Vietnam era called Search and Destroy, and you take a helicopter-borne unit into a village, and you need to secure the village. And there's lots of counters on the board. The only difference is they're upside down. Terribly, the best thing to do is stay out of range and blast them with rockets and machine gun fire. If you don't, you'll go near them, one of them will reveal itself and shoot at you and ambush you and maybe kill some of your men, which is a bad thing. The problem is, of course, you don't know which of the counters are real VC and which are innocent civilians. And it's a really bad thing if you start slaughtering innocent civilians. There's a very, very simple mechanic which will actually allow you to simulate one of the key problems of operations in a limited war in a civilian environment. Okay? There are all sorts of ways of doing all the other things like stabilization. You can get victory points for building bridges, for building infrastructure. You can try and influence populations towards your side. But the designer of Volker Ruhr, the designer of a game called Labyrinth about the war on terror, board game, just published in the past couple of years, and he captures all of this sort of thing, the fight for influence on a global scale, between the bad guys and the good guys like us. We're always the good guys, of course. But using political instruments more than military, do you see? So all of these things can be captured. There tends to be a force-on-force dimension which is particular to wargames. If there's no force-on-force dimension at all, then negotiation, simulation, role play, and so on may be your best way to go. And that tends to be much better understood. I'm sure you've done those sorts of things. Academics have done a lot more of those things than they have with wargames. I'm trying to suggest how you can do the force-on-force part. Integrating that with the other dynamics is perfectly feasible. It has been done, and it's just a matter of going and reading up and seeing how that's happened. I don't give too many examples in my book, because as I say, I've only got 160,000 words in the book to do it. But there's plenty of good literature and some good examples like the one I've mentioned, which show you how you can take gaming to that level.
Volko?
Volko, okay. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the role in games for learning of a concept that you mentioned, I think, just once or twice, and that's fun.
Mm-hmm.
If I understand it right, you see a disadvantage to games for entertainment in that they have to design for fun, which could sacrifice accuracy and, I don't know, possibly simplicity.
Yeah.
I'm an instructor, and so I have the challenge of engaging my students,
Yeah.
who, to my horror, do not all love board games, and sometimes don't even, heavens, don't even necessarily love the issue that I want them to explore in the classroom. So, and I wonder if you face that challenge, and if so, do you design also for fun? And if fun is something that it presents difficulties for either accuracy or simplicity or both, how do you balance those, and what can you recommend?
It's a very good question, and as you might expect, there's no easy answer to it. Fun is double-edged. A lot of you will use the term serious games. What's the opposite of serious games? Presumably fun games. So that suggests there's something bad about fun games, even though, which would you rather play? A serious game or a fun game? A fun game, okay? So, what you want is to achieve the educational objective in the case of teaching games. You can achieve that by the students having fun, really engaging with it, as long as they don't see this as, oh, we're just going to have one of Professor Sabin's silly games now. Thank God we don't need to actually read any books and learn anything. Yeah? You've got to balance those two. It's hard to do. If you start making compromises and saying, I could simulate this, but it wouldn't be much fun to do it, therefore we'll do something else and distort history and distort reality for that purpose, I think you're going on a slippery slope, frankly. Fortunately, I think that there's something inherently fun in games, even serious ones, so there is not actually the dichotomy, because they're engaging, they're participating, they're competing, they're trying to win, they're talking to their friends, and so on. Do you see? So I think the fun comes almost naturally. You don't need to be too worried about designing it in deliberately, consciously. You almost get that as a freebie. What you need more to avoid is the idea that this is just fun, it's not learning, that we shouldn't actually engage our brains. And to do that, as I say, it's part of the design to make the design as good a simulation as you can within the limits of the abstraction you need to go to, plus the design notes, plus leaving time for the discussions rather than just saying, okay, we had a fun game, bye-bye. Yeah? All of those sorts of things. I don't think you need to consciously emphasize the fun element in it, because almost that comes with the package.
Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Stanovich from the Warfighting Lab at Quantico. I just a curious, sort of semi-personal question. What made you choose the first battle of Fallujah?
I didn't choose it. That was a student a couple of years ago. And it's interesting because most of the recreational war games focus on pre-1945 history. There's not that many, Falkers is an exception, which are about contemporary or near-contemporary operations. Understandably, a lot of my students are interested in the contemporary operations which are in their lifetime, so they will tend to model those sorts of things. And I can lend them simulations which are about city fighting, for example, which they can then bring up to date in the present and simplify. So it wasn't my choice. I leave the students entire freedom of choice as to which ones they want to simulate. He wanted to understand, and you can download that simulation, by the way, from our website, so you can see his own design notes for yourself. There's about 4 dozen of them there now. But he wanted to understand what went wrong, basically. You know, in the first Battle of Fallujah, why did we suffer such losses? And then, in fact, this year, not on the website yet, there's a student who's done the second Battle of Fallujah. So, you know, looking at the, sorry, we were talking about cross purposes.
No, I find it interesting that, I don't know if the ability to design a game will educate into the sort of historical misunderstandings on the part of the game designer as well.
Yeah.
First Fallujah it's very bizarre, by the way, to see a battle war game that you happen to be in. The first one went probably as smooth as the second one, tactically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was sort of curious about that choice. The second one seems to be more rewarding, I guess, at the end. But
Sure.
it was an interesting observation that the younger students would like to see the contemporary.
Well, as I say, you can understand it, and I think it's a very good thing that they want to apply those skills to the present. I think a lot of recreational game designers think they're providing, in a sense, escapism, rather like Hollywood. That people want to use the paper time machine. They don't want to go just to Fallujah where they've seen it on the news and it's all horrible and they can't really, you know, look somebody like yourself in the face and say, I'm playing a game about a battle in which your friends got killed. Okay? So there is a sensitivity about modern gaming which affects the recreational side, and when you put it in the educational domain, perhaps it's less sensitive, which is why I'm pleased that they do this. As I say, it's their choice, and all I will say is, can it be done? Is it too complex a situation to be gamed, so you're really biting off more than you can chew? Is the evidence there? Because there are plenty of interesting battles, but if the evidence is not there, they simply aren't going to be able to do it. Writing a book, or certainly an essay, about a battle is trivial compared to the information that you need to be able to design a simulation on it. And of course, with a modern one, it is often hard to get the two-sided information which will allow you to design a credible simulation. So that is the problem with trying to do the modern stuff, however interesting and topical it might be. But read the students' design notes. That's the best I would say.
Matt?
Matt Kirschenbaum, University of Maryland. I was wondering if you could comment on the nature of innovation in wargame design. And so, a classic example, 1993, we get We the People from Mark Herman, the first card-driven game. Where does that come from? It's not technological, where with computer gaming you say, well, there's this new graphics card and we have these new capabilities now. It's not a social context, right? You don't say this is a game that couldn't be designed until after we passed civil rights.
Yeah.
So how do you account for the nature of innovation in game design?
Thanks, Matt. It's a very good question. I think part is the search for novelty. If you can market something as a great new concept, you're more likely to get some sales. Sometimes that concept really doesn't take off. There was a wave in late 70s, I would imagine, for what was called double-blind games. And the idea there was, rather than having all the counters on the map, each side has their own map, they're sitting back to back, they move only their own counters and they show where their front line is, and they shout out, I'm moving into hex X3, you got anything there? Oh, no. Right, I'm now moving into X4, got anything there? You see? And this was marketed as, you know, the great innovation, solves the fog of war problem, no game will ever be designed in the old way again. There are about half a dozen games done double-blind and it all died out. Why? Because it was so bloody time-consuming to do it, and because you could actually achieve something like the same effect in other ways, and I've illustrated some of that. Okay? So innovations will tend to have costs as well as benefits. There is a fashion thing. You mentioned the card-driven games. Some people love the card-driven games. That tends to have been adopted and taken off. And of course, Clauswitz said, you know, use cards. So I'm surprised people didn't pick it up earlier. A big problem though with the card-driven games, like the double-blind ones, if you're playing the game solitaire, and many players just like to play around with it, see what happens. Yeah, just experiment with it for their own edification. Tweak the rules to their heart's content. How do you have secret hands of cards when you're swapping sides and you don't know what the enemy's got in their hand, you see? So most of these things are not innovations which will supersede what has gone before. There are still games being designed, and you'll find some of them in my book, which use essentially the techniques of the 1970s. Because there was something right about those, which is there as an irreducible core, do you see? What has tended to happen over time, and I think it's in many ways a regrettable development, though entirely understandable, is that you have got game design becoming more complex, manual game design becoming more complex. I think the reason for that is that people who've mastered the earlier systems and want something more accurate will say, I don't just want the I go, you go, entirely open system. I want something new. Cards, impulse systems, interactive activation, all these things layered upon that basis. That's fine for those who like complex games. It really puts off the novices, who don't even understand the basis of hexes and movement and zones of control and things that the grognards, as they call themselves, the veterans of gaming, take for granted. I think that's the one reason why board gaming has become a very small sort of priesthood, because these games have been designed more and more for people who already play them, this dwindling band of rather aging men, you imagine, at the expense of openness to the newcomers, and that's partly why I've tried to react against that. So to the extent there's innovation over time which sticks, often it's not as productive as it might be. But as I say, the novelty aspect is very important. And of course people have great new ideas. Rarely though can we reinvent the wheel and say, okay, I've got this pentagonal thing which actually works better than something that somebody invented ages ago and has no drawbacks. That's the point.
I'm Neil Byrne. I'm a retired Navy captain. This is more along the lines of validation of what you're saying rather than a question. When I was director of training at Tactile, what we found was that our manual simulation was a lot more effective at training than the computer. NWICS. The NWICS computer system would fill this room. The problem is that computers do one other thing well. They lie very well. And our computer was lying like a rug because the software was a comic strip.
Yep.
When we got into the database of what was going on in this room, what we found out was that the sonar algorithm was a radar algorithm that was stuck upside down on the bottom of the ship. And so it was doing horrible, it was demonstrating horrible and totally unrealistic capability ascribed to things that would never do that in the real world. But when you cloak this stuff inside a computer, and then you compound the problem by using it on a relatively untrained student body. Okay, naval officers are very poorly trained in tactics, and so and they will believe it, and so it became. We had to ultimately disable 18 of the 19 modules that were in it. The only thing we allowed the computer to simulate for us was the movement of things. That was it. Yeah. Everything else had, but our tabletop simulation was much better because you couldn't cloak your goofiness anymore. Okay, that there was always somebody in the room who knew enough about what was going on the table to stand up and say that's bullshit. Yeah. And so and learning would then occur.
Right. And this encapsulates a lot of what I was saying in that area. Transparency is a good in itself. I'm very worried by the way in which, if you get a good manual war game designed for the military, let's say, their next step is, okay, computerize it. Computerize it. As if that in itself will make the results more reliable. It actually makes them less reliable because the only judgments you get out of the computer are the ones that the designer has programmed into it. Okay? And you cannot see whether those are right or not. Now, it might be that a system which is completely opaque and you can't argue with, the computer says yes, the computer says no, has some sort of dominance over an umpire that you can argue with. But it doesn't make it any more valid. In fact, it probably makes it less valid because in effect you're creating an artificial intelligence judgment rather than the informed judgment of a person.
And you're engaging in negative training.
Sure. Yes.
What we used to say was no training is better than negative training.
Yeah.
That if you don't train Lieutenant Bufovnik in a combat situation, he might. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible, but he might figure out what to do. But if you train people wrong for combat situations, what happens is that at the time he most needs to know what you're trying to teach him, every nerve in his body is screaming at him to panic. And he's going to revert to what you taught him.
Yeah.
And if you've taught him wrong, you've just killed him. And not just him, because he's the decision maker. You've killed all the people who are working for him besides, who are depending on him. And that's very dangerous. And computers, in this way, especially the way the Navy accomplishes this, are bad.
Okay.
Dangerous.
Thanks for that. Next question.
The corollary to that, though, and I completely agree that one way players don't know why something worked or didn't work because they can't see the dice rolling. For all you know, you rolled snake eyes in that move and it's computer, but you didn't know it, so I guess that's why you don't know what happened, why you just got lost. But the corollary to that, though, is to make sure you use the war game for the right purpose. And we have far too many folks in uniform who are using war games in place of what modeling simulation can do properly used as a proper tool, and they're mistaking one for the other. They think a war game has conducted the campaign analysis for them, or they use the campaign analysis and assume that it's done the wargaming. The question is, what is the purpose? What's the question you're trying to analyze? Are you trying to train people, or are you trying to draw a conclusion? Don't mistake the two.
Yeah, absolutely. As in military operations in general, the aim is the key thing. Different things will be appropriate for different purposes. Different types of war game, different approaches. Long list war games was the sixth one out of all of them. All of them are important in varying degrees to teach or to investigate, research a particular issue. Usually the more of them that you can use to illustrate different aspects of it, the more you'll understand it than just going through one particular angle. But the balance among them and the balance within the types of war game should be fundamentally influenced by what are you trying to get out of it.
Carl Miller from RAND. Phil, in addition to the very diverse group of, or reasonably diverse group of students that you teach at King's and introduce to wargaming, you've obviously also done it with a variety of military audiences. Are there sort of generalizable differences that you find in how this is received across civilian, more academically oriented and more operationally military oriented audiences that have then fed back into how you teach the material?
I think the biggest determinant of what attitude people will take to this is their attitude to wargaming in general. It's very difficult to go beyond preaching to the converted. People have prejudices and preconceptions about wargaming, which will tend to turn them away from it or lead them to view it with a jaundiced eye, unless somehow they've had, I would suggest, the veils lifted from their eyes, but I would say that, wouldn't I? So I think that's by far the most important determinant. The people who've done it don't need that much convincing, and actually there's a lot of people in this room who I think fall into that category. The real uphill struggle is getting others even to engage with it and to take it seriously at all. And I'm not sure that will ever be wholly resolved. For the military side, I think it's an easier approach because they can see the linkage between well-done games and the conflicts they're actually engaging in. For academics, scholars, it's very, very hard to to do so. I mean, take my course. It's an option course. People choose to do it or not. Those who don't take it, which is the majority, of course, look through the window and see us doing this. What on earth are they doing? Playing games. And that's silly, you know. I pay good money for this course. I want to be taught. So I think that is very. I mean, it's striking, of course, that you're here from Rand, and you perhaps have some knowledge of wargaming. I better not say that because it's a dirty little secret, isn't it, for some of us in some environments. So I think that's the most important. Using wargames to change people's minds is hard. Now, with my BA students, we play the games regardless of whether they want to or not. They're all in the class to learn about World War II, to learn about ancient warfare, whatever. Then you can have a captive audience, if you like, and start to change people's minds a bit. And as long as you don't overface them, as long as you don't say we're going to spend a lot of time doing this, as long as you make it fun, and as long as you show how it's relevant to their learning, you can get some converts, you can get some people on board. Okay. But you know, what makes a person a wargamer and interested in it versus this is a game? Why would I do that? I'm not a child anymore. I don't think it's an entirely rational consideration. I think it's something much more visceral within someone's deep psychological makeup, which is really an attitude which is really hard to change.
Regarding the components you use in classroom for the games, I noticed that the photo of Hell's Gate, the map sheet, and the hexes and the counter pieces looked extremely large based on what's commercially available.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just because you've got only a few hexes and only a few counters doesn't mean you can't make them really big. Most games would have maps maybe of that size, but tiny little half-inch hexes. The beauty of this here, unlike with a computer screen, is that for virtually no money, you can actually expand it by 500%, you see. So yes, deliberately we use big components, nice big chunky components, easy to see, easy to handle. There's virtually no cost to that, as long as you've got a table which people can reach across, basically. My Lost Battles game, when we do it at shows and we've got a really big table, we will do it on a 9-foot by 7-foot board with big figures, and it looks really nice. The system is no different to the one you can play on a table the size of what I'm standing in front of, but it looks nicer and it makes a bigger impression, you see. And as I say, the key point is, unlike the graphic enhancements in computer games, which absorb enormous amounts of money, by far the greatest part of the cost, in order to bring it up to the kind of standard that you saw illustrated there, this is cheap, almost inconceivably cheap in relative terms.
I'm Tom Blau from India. Very interesting. I wonder if you see these activities, these games, used in two kinds of analysis to generate surprises. One is the writing of history, where we don't get to run the tape again, so maybe we can test some canonical interpretations of why things happened, and maybe they would have happened some other way. The other is in intelligence, where we continually have a problem of asking analysts to step outside of their own skins and to allow themselves to transcend their mindsets, which is of course impossible. But if you could run, particularly if you could run more than one of these exercises, it might be interesting, and it might be a virtual red team in that box.
Okay, again, some very good questions. I could talk for a long time. I'll try and keep it brief. There is a school of a scholarship about counterfactual history. What might have happened, the dynamics of what happened and how it might have varied. Richard Ned-Lebeau is a really good theorist of that, and I'm pleased to say he's coming to join us at King's College in September, so I'm hoping to work with him on that. That in itself is controversial. Some people really don't like, some historians really don't like the counterfactual approach. They say, what happened, happened, anything else is a parlor game. Even counterfactual historians, this one who's done a draft review of my book, don't always like war games. And saying, well, this is apolitical and, really, I don't like this sort of approach at all, and it's giving history a bad name. you see. So that's not easy. In my Lost Battle book, I do try to use modelling in the way I said to actually cast new light on this vexed debate about some of these battles, which basically is going nowhere because anyone can guess whatever they like and there's no way of reconciling those. Have people paid much attention? Have scholars paid much attention? No. Has the book sold well and has it engaged lots of members of the public and members of the interested, enthusiast community? Yes. 10 times as many as most books on the subject would do. Great, good. But has it changed minds of those who think there's only one way we can do this, which is people basically agree with me and my reconstruction, not me, them? No. So it's difficult. I think there is scope, but you need to convince people, hence what I said in terms of my answer to Carl. Now, your other point, though, I think is fundamental. Both are very good, but the second point, I think there's a more positive answer to it.
You're hurting my feelings there.
I think that one of the greatest things about wargaming is that when you try to model a campaign or a battle, you need to analyze it far more than to write an essay about it. You need to know what the impact of logistics was, what the impact of the terrain was, the impact of intelligence, all the many factors. And you need to incorporate them or think how they can be abstracted or whatever. You really know what's making that battle or campaign tick. You do that over a number of historical engagements, over a number of different periods, different eras, different locations. You get practiced in looking at a situation, distilling it to its essence, and analysing it, and seeing what the dynamics are. You then transfer that analytical skill across to whatever the next crisis is. I think you're going to have a hell of an advantage in understanding what might happen compared to someone who's just used to writing an essay about the past, do you see? So I think in terms of the historic modelling the history, I think in terms of the counterfactual side, it's problematic, though I think there are things that can be done. But in terms of a skill that can be gained by the means of analysing past engagements, which can then be ported across to analyse the future. And we don't just say, oh, it'll be like the last war, which is our standard assumption. Yeah? We actually look for changes as well as looking for parallels. That, I think, is one of the greatest utilities of wargaming to defence professionals such as yourselves.
Brant?
Brian Guillory from Harness Electrons. I want to take a slightly different turn, similar to what you're just talking about. The knowledge and expertise needed to design and develop these games, especially the historical games that the research needed, there's a vast amount of research that has to go into that, and you've noted that already a couple of times. As someone who kind of uniquely stands across both wargaming and academia, an example would be Lee Brimacombe-Wood. The guy, to my knowledge, doesn't have any significant academic credentials in military history. However, you'd have a hard time finding somebody that knows more about air operations in the Western Theater of World War II than Lee. How, if at all, can someone try to advocate for some sort of better representation of the expertise these guys have, that when they show up at a military history discussion, that they're taken seriously with the seriousness they deserve for the research they've done, without having a bunch of initials after their name? And do you have some thoughts on how that can work to their advantage?
Again, it's not that hopeful an answer, I'm afraid. You're absolutely right about Lee. I have had a student just recently, just last year, researching a day within the Battle of Britain, 7th of September, and I suggested to him and put him in contact with Lee because I knew Lee had done the kind of detailed operational research which could point him to some of the sources. Absolutely correct. Now, there's a problem of the guild. There's a problem of the validation which is given to a profession by rank, job, etc. Whatever your profession, you paid a lot of money for it on the basis of your expertise. It doesn't feel very comfortable when someone comes along as an amateur and says, oh, I know so much as you, and I can argue with you on the same basis. Professions will often, in their own interest, seek to exclude such people, and they do it, of course, on the basis that for every Lee Brimacombe-Wood, or the equivalent, there's a hell of a lot of Elmer Fudds who know bugger all. You see, and therefore, and that's true of wargames, by the way, For every war game which is a good one, there are quite a few which are pretty poor. And they will tend to take the rest. The academics will fall back on, I don't know which is good or bad, I don't understand the thing at all, but I do understand the peer review system, I understand the sort of validation which has allowed someone to get a PhD, to become a professor, and so on. So breaking into that is hard. It's not unique to war games, by the way. There are some scholars, independent scholars, writing about things. They find it difficult to be taken as seriously as they sometimes, not always, sometimes deserve, because they don't have this institutional affiliation. And I fear, as I say, some of it comes down to, look, you know, if everybody could write on this, why is it justified that I'm paid X number of thousands of dollars to do it? Yeah. So it is a hard one. I think it is pushing out, but you're not going to get a full solution.
Okay, we probably have time for one last question.
Is there anybody else emailed anything, by the way? So I'm conscious we only had one of those.
Yeah, there's another email also from the folks at the Naval War College about beyond iterating a game with different players, how do you use manual games as a problem-solving tool, and what analytic processes do you incorporate in the design of a manual game to explore future possibilities or issues?
Oh, okay, that only took me 10 seconds.
I've worked you.
I did ask, yes, you're right. It doesn't just need different players, for a start. I think just playing a game over and over again, with the players of that game, learning from experience, exploring different variations, different random and so on, will give you some important extra lessons. And therefore, the simpler it is, the quicker it is, the more that you can do that. Yes, bringing in different players, in fact having it going out and being played by lots and lots of people, will tend to give you a much bigger sample. And you can do that, by the way, not just by having a computer simulation. You press a button and it does it 10,000 times. You produce a game, you sell it to 1,000 people, and they play it and you know, give you comments. And very quickly it will emerge online in the discussion fora whether the game is balanced towards X or Y, whether there's a clear strategy which will work. So there are various different ways in which you can get that iteration. Now the other part was using it as a tool to go to the future.
For future problems and issues.
This is one of the most challenging things for any game, I think, computer or manual. In order to do that, you really have to have a crystal ball which will be able to look into the future. Nothing different from that about writing any kind of speculative work. What will happen? What's the future of US force structure or the Middle East or whatever it might be? Well, you know, a finger in the wind. Yes, you can get data, but data will not always follow trend lines, and some data matter more than others, and that balance of importance shifts over time, do you see? The further you're going away from the known, the more speculative it is inevitably going to be. This applies, by the way, also to counterfactual speculation. It's another reason why it's difficult. You program into the game what actually happened, or you refine the game to look at what actually happened. As soon as you start exploring something else, what if Grouchy had come along at Waterloo and had been able to intervene? Yeah, you can play it, but have you really captured within the system what would happen, the second order effects and so on, the feedback loops? Even worse when you're looking at the future. I think wargaming is a tool for the reasons I've given, partly for the analytical skill that it gives the designers, partly also because of the way it can codify warfare, capture some continuing trends. I think that wargaming is at least as good as, and arguably better than, the other tools that we use, the finger and the wind predictions. So, for example, if we're still in the ancient world, I think you could learn a lot about future battles in the ancient world from the system that I've devised for the past few hundred years of them. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's never going to give you the absolute answer, because we're not, we don't have that crystal ball.
All right, I did offer one last question to the folks in the room, so if anybody wants an opportunity to jump on it.
I'd just like to make one more comment about the board game being big, as you mentioned there before. I've found in my work that how important it is to have a tactile connection to what's going on. I mean, there's a great picture I have actually taken in the 1950s at the Naval War College, where they got masking tape, models, and curved rulers on the deck, and they're playing this war game. It's interesting because that's how we gained World War II. And there's a brilliant letter by Nimitz written to the Naval War College that said the only thing that surprised us was the kamikaze. And creating that tactile connection where people can put their hands on something, move a piece, touch a chart, touch a map, is irreplaceable.
That's one of the reasons why miniature wargaming continues to grow despite manual wargaming declining.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I agree with both of those. It used to be the case that there were far more board war gamers in the United States than there were miniatures gamers. It was the reverse in Britain and Europe. Now, it's been suggested there are as many miniatures gamers as there are board gamers, as that group declines, partly because of this tactile feature. It doesn't only apply to the recreational. There's a lovely story about a general coming along and they were going to run a war game and they were worried. Would he, be entirely biased against this? Would he see it as just a facile sort of thing? Came in the door and he said, "Where are the toys?" And he wanted to be able to move the little tanks around, and then he was happy. So yeah, even at the general's level, we can have fun. I would say revert to being kids, but we can have the fun that Volker talks about.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and of course, thank Dr. Sabin. On behalf of CASL, we run these events because we're trying to bring the community of gamers in sort of the broadest possible definition together. And as the first international speaker we've had, this has been a great broadening of that circle, and being able to broadcast overseas means there's now more international folks who are able to attend virtually. And we think that that's a good way of expanding out the community. And we hope that you'll continue to attend these events and continue to speak at these events and help grow that community. With that, I'm going to stay seated so I stay near the mic, but I'd like to present a CASL coin on behalf of all of us for being willing to come today and speak to us. It's been a fascinating presentation, and I hope you've all enjoyed it, and you'll stick around for a few moments for folks. And other than that, if you can join us online, we'll continue the conversation. Hopefully this recording will be posted, and that will also expand and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for attending.